Can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, I just finished doing some reading on our topic.
You did? Are you
Yeah,
trying to get ready for the night session?
I'm trying to have my backside protected. How's your evening going?
Oh, okay. There's not a whole lot going on around here right now.
As here, I just went to the store and it's the first time they changed the hours, and I had witnessed it online about lines and stuff, but within walking distance, I went to the grocery store and there was a lot of people, and the first thing they announced, there is no toilet paper.
Go figure.
It just amazes me how people respond to, a intense situation.
Yeah, yep. And it's pretty universal. Hi, Jeffrey.
Hi.
Hi, Jeffrey. Yeah, it is.
I did my homework.
Yeah.
Yeah, Michael was just telling me he did his too.
I was up half the night finishing the book.
Oh, no. Whoa. Dedication. I don't know if I can handle it. Yeah. No, they just announced today that in Bavaria, you're not allowed out unless you're going to work, the doctors, or the store. And in Austria, they have instituted a rule that if they find more than 5 people gathered anywhere, it's a 3,000 euro fine.
Wow.
So,
I have to say, in Quebec City, I went to my cafe yesterday and it's closed today for the foreseeable future. So, I mean, it's not mandatory, but voluntarily it's all shutting down,
Yes, everything's kind of slowed here as well. There's still people that haven't been watching the news, I think. It's the same with Michael.
That's all we've got to do now is watch the news.
Yeah. Well, or you could stay up half the night reading the Axial Age and its consequences. I mean,
are the two mutually exclusive?
Huh?
Are the two mutually exclusive?
In a certain sense, I'd say so. Yeah, the university where my daughter works, she called today. She was off sick, but she called because they had changed the rule. And anybody who's over 60, everybody's supposed to be home for the next 2 weeks anyhow. And anybody over 60 has to stay home until the end of April. And people who have people over 60 in their house are kind of on the borderline, whether or not they want them to show up or just stay home. So, I belong to the endangered group. Hey, DJ, how you doing?
Hi.
Yeah, I got to get those buttons pushed. Swoosh is fleet.
Can't hear you, TJ. No.
Mm-mm.
Still nothing?
That's better.
That's better. Could be a little louder.
It could always be a little louder, but I need to.
I'm telling you, you have to take pity on old guys like me who can't hear all that well anymore.
I'll have to try to project.
Yeah, okay, do that. Yeah. I can't even go get a hearing aid. So,
how's everybody doing?
Good.
Not the worse for wear.
All things considered.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to keep my balance.
Now, the weather's going to be nice this week, so I can go out for walks.
That's good.
That's a good part. We're not cooped up in the house, but we're not going. Nobody's going anywhere doing anything. So, hi,
Hi,
John.
Johnny.
Hey, John.
Hey,
Greetings, everyone. I'm trying to get set up here.
Hold on.
Hello, everyone.
Hey,
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I can hear you.
Are we expecting anybody else or?
I don't think so. I think this is the core group.
I think this is the whole group.
Yeah. But I think others have been following us because
Yeah.
I've been, I think, who was it? Someone quoted this group a couple of times. I think it was Marco. in some of his
Oh.
posts. So I think other people might listen in on occasion or follow some of the threads that we've had. I have an opening question, which I don't know who wants to respond to it, if anyone wants to respond to it, but we started this program, this project, I think it was, when was it, 6 months ago? Or was it last?
Well, it was longer than that. I think it was like a year ago.
TJ, when did we start this conversation? A
I
year
think,
ago?
I guess about that. Yeah, the second conversation was in July. Because I remember we were talking about how hot it was, and your admonishment at the time was we better laugh while we can.
Yeah, and I remember the initial conversation, we talked about a lot of things, but I remember we started off, I don't know what my original question was. It had something to do with, but we generated some metaphors. And I thought that was an interesting way to start off. It was sort of a exploration on my part. And I think it was TJ, a well-lit path, Jeffrey, a garment, Ed, a radio, an old radio, Michael, a story around a campfire, and John, a prayer. And I'm just curious, this is an open question, this is a question I have for myself, and we can move on because I'm really interested in what other people are, where they would like to start. What do we know now about a well-lit path, a garment, that old radio, a story around a campfire, a prayer that we did not know back then? And basically, I'm just offering, how can we stimulate our imaginations to play the catch-up game, which is very different from the mustard game? Because when you play the catch-up game, you're trying to reconstruct something that happened, but we all have different versions of it. And I think this is pretty central to the whole historical project, is memory, the nature of memory, whose memory is it? The first person, the phenomenal experience that we each have, the metaphors that we use to reconstruct our own experience of our personal histories, and how do those personal accounts figure into the accounts of the lives of people who perished hundreds and thousands of years ago. We only have artifacts that these people actually ever existed at all. And how do we reverse engineer those artifacts to figure out who the hell were they? And what cognitive capacities did they have? And how similar or different were they from us? And this is something that led to another explanation that TJ and I were in with the Davor, talking about generations. And I think we also, some of that may be common knowledge among us. But anyway, I'm just curious about this community, this project that we've engaged in for a couple of years, 3 years for some of us, about how we are creating perhaps a knowledge community, working with different visions, different capacities, looking at poetry, looking at history, looking at physics. And what do we know now that we didn't know before all this started. Anyway, that's my spiel, because I think we're in the middle of a huge transition on a very grand scale with this pandemic. And how each of us, how this pandemic is appearing in each of our lives right now. I'm just thinking of JFK, his assassination. Anyone who was alive at that time remembers where they were, just like 9/11. I think this, if whoever survives remembers the pandemic, will be very, very high on their list of personal memories. So I'm really interested in how those historical events become personal memories, and those historical events that occur beyond our time frame, but beyond our lifetimes, how those are still, how we engage in that. Anyway, that's my sort of orientation here, and I'm really curious about how or where anyone else would like to start. Thank you. I apologize for rambling a bit. I'm a little overwhelmed this morning.
I was going to, Michael, did you want to go?
No, you can go first, Jeffrey.
I sort of the one who relaunched this thing, so I thought maybe I might speak to that. I'm very happy to have, because I was saying to Ed and Michael that I spent half the night reading the final chapters of this book, so I would be doing my homework, as it were. And I'm actually really pleased that I did that, because the final chapters they have something interesting to say, and there is a kind of closure there that I think I was looking for. Obviously, I could have done that on my own without you guys, but I always really appreciate all the different insights that I get from the group environment. And in terms of garments, I have unfinished garments that I've been working on, but I tend to want to finish the garment if I've started it. So
I hope someday you'll try it on and show it to us all. I'm looking forward to that.
So, for instance, I read the chapter, I can't remember which one it is, it's near the end, about education. And I found that a real eye-opener, because it was a way of looking at education, the way education is set up today, but in terms of the axial, if I don't know whether we believe the axial transformation, but I think to some extent we do. But the sort of the axial turn, as it were, as being the origin of today's education system. And it helps explain some of the peculiarities of our educational system. That from, you look at them and you don't really understand why things are set up this way. And it helped me, sort of made me rethink certain things about that I have trouble with the educational system in this way. And I found that very, very interesting in terms of my own thinking. I mentioned in the preamble to this that I found that the section on violence was very interesting, partly because I'm writing about violence and religious violence in some of my own fiction, and I actually found that chapter quite useful in terms of, so it's this focus on end states, so Christianity and all the big religions that are focused on salvation or end of the world. So this is a relevant topic to the pandemic environment, where we all feel it's a bit the end of the world in terms of the way it feels, right? So so this sort of what they call eschatological, but it's this ends of things, and so violence, this idea that violence emerges when you have a sort of ultimate savior program, and therefore all violence is justified. And so you get this sort of violence coming out of this context of like the suicide bomber, if you like. But I think the suicide bomber is a kind of metaphor or a symbol, maybe not a metaphor, but a symbol for a lot of these kinds of violent activities that come in relation to religion. So, so I did find that chapter really useful for my own work. But it is it is all about making garments for me. So because I wear these things, I wear the education system. You know, I mean, I had my career in it for 40 years. You know, so it's part of my being, if you like, in some sense, and the whole, you know, the non-violence violence. I was involved in the Quaker movement. I spent my youth protesting nuclear arms and doing civil disobedience and getting arrested for it. You know, so the violence, non-violence is also something that I wear. So I found this book, it changed the way I understand myself in some important ways, as well as my relationship with the environment that I live in, a cultural environment. And so I do think it was an important book to read. It's full of the kinds of things that, Johnny, that you hate, this sort of pedagogic, pedantic, intellectualizing, all of this. Oh, it's awful, this stuff. but if you cut through the junk, it's still got something interesting to say. Even the writers I hate the most in that, you know, was it Martin? I hate his writing. I hate the ideas, the sort of cognitive, overly cognitive approach. And yet there are some interesting stuff in there. So I actually found it overall a useful proposal, useful approach. And hey, a garment, you put it in, and if you don't like it, you take it off, and it hasn't, you know, it hasn't necessarily be, it's no worse than putting something on and taking it off again, you know? You can always take it off again. However, the garments that we choose and we re-choose in our lives are more than just something we put on. They actually are, in some sense, part of us. So there's a kind of a way of thinking about that. Anyway, I'm going to stop there because I more want to hear what you guys have to say than what I have to say about this.
I just want to respond very briefly. You said garments that we choose and garments we can put on and we can take off. And my belief, which you sort of reinforced for me, is that when our metaphors are self-generated, they're not arbitrary. And that's where I think you've made a good case for that. Thank you very much, Jeffrey.
A bit like the whole idea of if you're trans, you choose the gender. No, it's not like that. You are the gender, and you're simply realigning yourself. You know, so.
Thank you.
Wow. Well, I'm gonna work with my metaphor of how I've changed, how I have come to embrace that metaphor a little deeper, well thought out, of being around the campfire. It's made me wonder that we were all around the campfire naked, trying to find the clothes. We needed Jeffrey to give us garments to stay warm and stuff. And how, as I've read through it, I think using your metaphor of trying to understanding and getting, you know, understanding myself more based on looking at that, I read Gepser's comment, and that was a good go back and look what his intention was, you know, of writing the book that you posted, TJ. But I also feel that I'm glad I stayed with my campfire metaphor, because in some ways I feel it took me out of Plato's cave and into the openness of time and space, and not being the cave being a conceptual garment, you know, protecting from the elements in a sense. And also as I was rereading the book and having to interact with the mundane and the pandemic, I almost feel like there was a certain embodiment of the metaphor of the Axial Age without of my own time and space, kind of filling in the details that were offered by I prefer to think of them as speculations that, okay, yeah, that's possible. My particular chapter I read was about the righteous rebellion, those, and I found that very well written and thought out, as far as bringing in where the religious and political, supposedly at this time, kind of were held together, because it was about resources and meaning of life. And you had all these different empires still acting tribal. The empires were still channeling a tribal mentality, even though supposedly we were trying to get beyond that tribal mentality, supposedly, but it got hijacked by the need for resources, I think, or how to, well, especially how to deal with others that had different behaviors. A lot of this, the tension for me in this Axial Age centers around power and behavior, and how do we manage that? How do we deal with each other's behavior from different places and coming in contact with other, and how certain geographies dealt with that development of the use of power, because my chapter was about those people that was trying to challenge the kings that were misusing power, and then the institutions, and trying to stand up for and challenging the use of power. I found that extremely relevant for today. So I really feel this got into my bones, kind of thing, of how it has relevance without being dogmatic. There's a relevance without being dogmatic.
I'm still listening to the radio, and there's still a lot of static, and I keep tuning. But sometimes when I was reading this book, I had the feeling I was on the shortwave band. And so you start hearing a lot of things that, it's like listening to a foreign language. When I was with my wife, and my daughters had to go for a week to England for university, and it was down in the southwest corner. So we were out driving around, and the clearest radio station we could pick up was in Welsh. Okay, well, I don't speak Welsh, obviously. I hardly speak English anymore, but it was the best station to listen to, even though neither of us understood a word that was ever being said. And there wasn't a lot of music being played. There were just a lot of people talking. I don't know what channel we had, but it was clear. And it was just nice listening to the rhythm of what people were saying. You can get, John will bear me out on this, you get a lot out of the tone, and you get the rhythm, and there's more being said in language than whatever the words that are trying to get across. And that's basically how I feel about some of the parts of the book here that we've been reading. But as a kind of a dyed-in-the-wool hermeneuticist, I'm fully aware that no matter what it is that I'm listening to or reading, it's going to change who I am. It's all engagement with other texts in whatever form, be they spoken, written, could be art, whatever, are life-changing. Now, we always use the word life-changing when it's some significant, monumental, momentous, oh my God, I'm not like I used to be. And then we don't realize, well, how did we get to where we are? Because when we all look back to where we were, say 20 years ago, we're not the same people. So a whole lot of changes had to take place to get to wherever we are. So our lives kind of change all the time. And that's kind of how I feel about what we've been reading. I agree with Jeffrey. Some of the authors in here who pissed me off the most probably taught me the most, simply because they pissed me off, which means I got to look at that again. Because now I'm going to figure out what it is, what they said was wrong, and it never was. You know, you can't find the wrongness and the rightness. That was something that I think Gapser taught me as well. It's not about right and wrong. It's about, well, this is how you see it, and why do you see it that way? And so you develop a whole different understanding from him. I had the chapter with Eisenstadt, who is he was a prolific scholar, and just in that sense, and what he went, his own biography is just impressive to begin with. And what struck me about I did the chapter on, he called it, it's one of my favorite words. I think maybe that's the reason I picked it, was the axial conundrums. Okay. And, and there was a conundrum, and he spent a good chapter saying, I have no clue. This is on my words. Okay? I have something was going on, but I can't put my finger on it. And I don't know how. I don't have a conceptual apparatus, which is what he obviously was looking for whatever reason. And he didn't have a conceptual apparatus to, I'm looking for the English word, to gather that together in some coherent way. So he could say, okay, this is what I think was going on. And it was obviously disturbing to him. It was a conundrum at the end of the chapter as well. He was still bothered by the fact that he couldn't put his finger on what it was. Something was different, but I don't know what. I got the same general sense in the chapter from Osman later, in chapter 15 or so, where he just goes, okay, well, maybe it's not even axial at all. You know, maybe we need to rethink this axial thing. Again, there's obviously things that are happening here, but we don't have a framework or an apparatus to do this. And I think Jaspers, you know, did a service on the one hand of identifying it, but on the other hand, it didn't really encapsulate or capture what it is that was going on. Through the course of our reading, of course, I always went back to see what Gapser was saying about this, and the notion of axial age is absent in ever-present origin. He mentions it a couple of times in footnotes when he refers to Jasper, but he just kind of lets it go because for him it wasn't axial in an axial sense. But obviously, he found a whole lot in that time frame that was worth looking at and worth examining because something was going on. He simply had, because he was outside of, let's say, the sociological historical community, he wasn't bound by it. He could make his own shit up if he wanted, which he did. And he said, I think if we look at it in these terms, we can kind of make sense of it, because he's unencumbered by all of that academic baggage that you have to take with you when you're formally engaged in these kinds of pursuits. So the book itself reminds us of, let's say, periods of transition and change or mutation, or however it is that we want to discuss about that. I find it absolutely fascinating in light of this pandemic. I can't tell you how many people I've been corresponding outside of the Infinite Conversations platform, or just in people that I'm talking to around the house, who all are looking at this as, you know, like, if we don't get it now, when are we going to get it? And it's a kind of thing. And being the curmudgeon that I am, you know, if you're hoarding toilet paper, you didn't get it. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure that there's a lot of getting being done. And I'm not faulting anyone for that. And I don't think it's all that unusual. You know, we hope that the shift will automatically occur, but they don't. I was watching on Sunday evenings. There's always a show on German TV at 7:30. It's right before the police show comes on at, you know, a mystery, murder mystery kind of thing at 8:15. And for the last, and I found it very interesting, for the last 2 weeks, they've been doing the title of the show. It's kind of a natural history kind of show. They look at the world, they look at the planets. It's called Terra X, okay? The unknown Earth kind of thing, and they examine it. And the last 2 episodes have been about the Anthropocene, explaining what it was, looking at it from the elements. They first looked at, well, what in the Earth? And the session this time was about air. So it was the Anthropocene in the air. And next week is the Anthropocene and water. So they're actually going through and trying to uncover, why is it that we would think that we humans are having such an impact on the planet that people have to rethink their naming of geological ages for us. And it's very interesting in that regard, because I don't know who's watching and listening. You know, but somebody felt motivated to make for the general public TV show series, as a matter of fact, about this conceptual change. So, you know, on the one hand, you see these indications, and then on the other hand, you don't. So I'm kind of stuck in the middle between those. But one of the things that came out in both of those segments that we've seen thus far, he keeps saying it happened suddenly in geological terms. It's not suddenly in human terms. And it's a very subtle distinction that we have to make. You know, when we're looking, you know, no one individual was alive through the actual axial age. And so we only ever see it in the very, you know, in our 7 that we have. And that's something of a box that we're given that we always have to think outside of. And it's a real challenge, because that's the immediacy for us, I think. So again, I enjoyed the book, even though I disagree with most of what I was reading, but for that very reason, because this was one that made me think about things and challenge things. And it, you know, and because John had asked me if I'd found the right station yet, and it was, no, I'm still tuning and getting clear signals, and not, depending on weather and the atmosphere and everything else that's going on, and which band I might be on. And that's the helpful part, I think. So that's my take for now.
I'm not sure my path is any better lit than it was when I started. But I do think it's kind of a reinforcement, actually. I think that the light, we're all carrying the light. I don't think it's, I think I sourced it somewhere, you know, along the path, or, you know, coming from the distance, but we're really carrying it. And I think I brought this up before about just the whole way of seeing history. The whole feels versus facts argument, or whatever. It's the feels that interest me now, because it's the value system and the belief systems behind history that mean anything. As far, you know, the facts are what they're going to be, and you can always kind of find something that's going to support one or the other. But it's what are you bringing to that discussion? And I think that's the central. That's what makes it interesting. That's briefly on the metaphor. I don't know if that was enough. I'd like to throw this out there. I came across a book review of this book, of The Axial Age and Its Consequences. It's by Jack Sonis, and it came out the year that the book came out, and it's in Alternative Spirituality and Religion Review. And I just like to, if you bear with me, I pulled two short paragraphs out of it, which I thought really was interesting. The term axial age was coined by German philosopher Karl Jaspers in 1949 to describe the period of profound social, religious, and philosophical transformation that occurred in the 5th millennium BCE across Greece, Near East, India, and China. Transformations whose effects still shape the contemporary world. Yet Jaspers' treatment of this period was not a strict historical study, but rather a philosophy of history intended to recover the roots of European civilization in the wake of the great upheavals of his day, which of course is the Second World War and the First World War preceding it. And then he goes on and he says, Bellah's religion and human evolution represents a significant milestone in axial age scholarship, while his treatment of the axial cultures themselves, as opposed to pre-axial humanity, and hold that thought, is heavily reliant on the work of Eisenstadt and others. Bellah's innovation comes from his incorporation of evolutionary psychology and other forms of broad-scale history to recast the axial age as part of the long story of human cognitive and cultural evolution, rather than as some quasi-theological breakthrough from prehistory to history. Unfortunately, however, the present volume does not fully capitalize on that innovation. So they came to the same points that we all did in the last discussion about where these guys, the silos that these guys had. I thought that was pretty interesting.
Great minds work alike.
Thank you all. I just, what I was reading, I've read two chapters, but I'm just going to comment on the second one. Where do axial commitments reside? Anne Swindler is the author, and she's really interested in where we locate the axial age. And she's looking at Africa, where she's worked a lot. And she quotes from an author at the end of her chapter. I think it's an interesting quote that she's chosen. She's talking about she claims he's a great authority on Africa, and he describes a particular pattern, a historical pattern. One is a person, one belongs, one is part of a community, insofar as one is integrated in a complex system of authority, deference, and participation, which forms the backbone of the intersecting spheres of identity that matter for life in that given society. The idea that an individual could live utterly detached from any community is not one that finds favor or is even meaningful in Africa, as is made clear by the pejorative reputation such individuals inevitably acquire. He goes on to say, obligations, therefore, are not seen as the Western concept seems to imply, as impositions, claims on one's otherwise better used time and energy, but as a means of sustaining one's place in a network of belonging. And I find that so poignant. I had an experience just yesterday, the day before. A woman is a neighbor of mine. She was a neighbor of mine. She lived in my building for many years, but she's moved and she lives in another building in my neighborhood. I see her very infrequently on the street, and we bump into each other. We always give each other a hug. I saw her about a month ago, and we gave each other a hug. We chatted about, just things that were going on in the neighborhood and beyond the neighborhood. And then I saw her 2 days ago over by the track, over by the East River. I went over there to go, just get some fresh air and to, exercise outside with a lot of other people who were doing the same. And I bumped into her. I didn't bump into her, actually. I stayed 6 feet away from her. And it wasn't necessarily because I wanted to, but I sensed that this is, once again, I'm sensing into this, she was fearful of getting too close. And I wanted to respect that. It's not a fear that I have, it's a fear that she had, and I want to respect her fear so that we could have a beneficial exchange of energy information. And she's someone that I've known a long time, but not an intimate friend by any means, but definitely someone, an acquaintance that I have very high regard for. Also, she's an historian and she knows a lot of information. She reads much more deeply than I do. So I was really interested in her opinions on a lot of things that were going on in our world. And she did update me on some stuff. But I just was, and then I noticed yesterday, walking down the street, I saw a group of, actually there were 2 different occasions, but one was at a bookstore and I saw 3 young people, 4, they were mixed ages, but it was obvious that one of the persons was a favorite of the other 4 people, and they hadn't seen each other a long time. And so she gave everybody a hug and she says, I don't care about the virus. And they said, okay, we don't care either. We're going to hug you right back. And I think that's the kind of tensions and stresses that are being placed upon us, is this whole idea of, what do they call it? Social distancing, which is different from quarantining. A quarantine is very dramatically different from a social distancing, which is like being able to maintain 6 feet distance between each one another. I think this is very poignant kind of collision that's happening between these systems, the materialistic descriptions of a virus, and our different interpretations and our ways of handling this information and making sense of it and making meaning together of it. This is also in this chapter with, there's a lot about AIDS in Africa in this chapter, and how, you know, chieftains and tribal communities and how they make the decisions on the ground, and then what they do with information about the AIDS virus and the strictly materialist explanation for it, and how they can take from that and do a spin on it and come away with their own, how they're going to deal with this in their communities. As they talk about the use of condoms or not, circumcision, male circumcision or not, you know, because there was an idea that at one time floating that uncircumcised men were not as likely to get the AIDS virus or to transmit it than, no, it was uncircumcised men were more prone, no, I'm confused now. Uncircumcised men were more prone to get the AIDS virus. I don't know how much of that has been discounted, along with other things we know about the so-called cause of AIDS, because so much of that has been revised now. 20, 30 years ago, it means something very different than it does now. And having been in that, in the trenches, in that incredible dogmatic assertions that were being made in the name of science, and the revision that has happened, it's so dramatic for me, because I had to live through my gut instinct. That may be a truth, or partial truth, half truth. That's bullshit. I don't know. And I think this, all in the name of science, is a lot of things are said in the name of science that are retracted, reinterpreted, deleted. But how do you make your decisions that are going to be, you know, sometimes life and death, based upon which kind of paradigm? And I think that's what's so dramatically brought into focus, I think, in our what's happening right now to us. But also, a lot of different people are thinking very differently about how to deal with this. Quarantining is practiced in Italy and in Spain now, I understand. Not in UK. UK has a different philosophy. They're talking about herding, the power of the herd to handle viruses is enhanced, because those who get the virus and survive it, which is almost everybody, except for maybe, I think, 1% who get it, who die of it. Usually they're very fragile and they're already sick, or who have underlying conditions like diabetes or obesity and old age, are more prone. Young people seem not to be getting it. So I think and children too. So there's debates about whether closing the schools is a good idea, since a lot of nurses and medical professionals have children that they can't take care of if they, you know, go to work. So these are the kind of trade-offs we have to figure out. But also this whole idea of like the UK making this decision not to quarantine. And there's also, how in the world are you going to quarantine New York City? You know, we're not like China. We don't have authoritarian rule. Anyway, I'm just offering that too, because there may be a case that could be made, and some people are making it, that the more people who catch the virus and who survive the virus can stabilize the human immune system much more effectively than quarantining. Because, as we may find out, that the quarantine in Wuhan in China, the cases are going down of this virus. We also, it's speculated that once the quarantine is over, there will be new strains of the virus that these persons who were quarantined will not be protected from. The way those who were unquarantined may have already stabilized and become immune to. So my question is, well, where is the axial age is the question that Ann Swindler is asking. Where do we locate the axial age? But also, or perhaps the second axial age, but where do we locate the human immune system? I mean, I have my immune system, you have your immune system, and then there's our immune system. So I think the boundary between what's inside and what's outside, and what is an anomaly, like a virus, perhaps, is very fluid. And I'm reminding of what Haraway said about the agent of change is never the virus. The host decides whether to let the virus in or not. So it's a dance. That's her metaphor for the relationship between the virus and that host. And there may be a transformational capacity which is unleashed in our human capacity to make sense and meaning, especially through our immune systems. It's basically what I think our immune systems do, is to make sense, not to defend identity. That is a very old school notion. The immune system is to defend identity, and we use battlefield metaphors. Shoot it, kill it, nuke it. And I think that's a very first order way of thinking about the immune system. I think a second order way of thinking about the immune system is, how do you dance with this? Maybe we don't have to nuke it or kill it. And what doesn't kill us makes us stronger, as Nietzsche once said. And how are we going to evolve and gather complexity without bacteria and microbes and viruses? They may be nature's way. Unfortunately, it's tragic sometimes. But also there may be transformational capacities that are unleashed in us through this encounter. So I'm just offering this too as very much, I believe, connected to this whole theme of the axial age, or the second axial age, and the second order culture, which we may be sponsoring in this encounter today among us all. So anyway, that's my spiel. Thank you very much for this opportunity once again to put into words stuff that's very slippery and very, very weird. Thank you.
You know, in listening to you, John, one of the things that I was stimulated by is the importance of metaphor. Because the axial age, that metaphor is mechanical to me. Now, when they described it as turning point, I shifted out of the mechanical, and it was a movement. It was more organic. And everything you were describing is learning how to trust that kinetic sense and how we move in the world, with the knowledge that, yeah, our age group is susceptible. I mean, you know, some people do have to quarantine differently. I had a conversation with my cousin in Ohio, and she's more along the line of self-quarantine, and we had a very nice exchange. She poked me and said, please don't go to the coffee shops, you know. I said, well, I appreciate your honesty and your concern, but that's not my approach, because actually I'm more along the lines of using social distancing, of being aware and being in environment, even with my age. So this is where I think and believe that when I read the Axial Age, I was probably doing a little dance of how I was working with the metaphors so that I could ingest and be my own, or take responsibility for my own interpretation, and knowing that I have baggage with it, because I've interacted with people, and like you, claim, I can sense people, and everybody's responding differently. And I love what you said about respecting other people's fear, because I think this is an opportunity that we can, from that notion of how we belong together at this time, it could be an opportunity to really move the ball. I'm not going to say it is, but I think the ball has moved, maybe not, there's always a plus and minus, but even since 9/11, the ball has moved in some ways. When we had that 9/11 thing, the ball has moved. It's been pluses and minuses. I mean, there's been a lot more, at least pushback of look at, that was a group, an isolated group within Islam that did that. Stop generalizing that all Muslims are the same. That's bullshit. That's, look at your own group. Christianity is not without its own baggage itself. So I really appreciate how you were nuancing that. For myself, as feet on the ground, I've done a lot of work of I've had to re-engage my training of not letting the hypervigilance that pops up control my fucking life.
Johnny, just to come back on your comments, where is the prayer?
You just answered my prayer, Jeffrey. Thank you. Thank you.
So we have read most of the book. We're in the third session. Have we decided what the axial age even is? No. Good.
Go for it.
I was mulling this over a couple of nights ago, and I think I have three avenues or keys, or okay, three ways on the path that we can go with this. But I'm going to kind of throw this out and kind of try to circle around to some of the comments that I've heard, which are really good. Let's go down three paths. The axial age is Jaspers' call for unity in the wake of the disaster of World War II. And it was a breakthrough of transcendental, this and otherworldly philosophies, religions, and all the rest of the stuff that he puts in there. But it's quite hyperbolic language, but so let's keep that as one idea. Two, the axial age was a time of great social and political upheaval, boiling down, of course you can't really boil anything down, but boiling down to challenging the divine kingships of the time with higher ethical standards. So transcendence, it's a tricky word, but what it really means is, okay, you're the king, but you're not just, I represent God, XYZ. Now you are subject to those same laws. Or three, the axial age is the shift in communication from oral tradition to writing. And it's that shift in communication that in turn pulled culture and all the rest of it with it. And it's really something that you can only look back upon the period and assess as an age, as a specific phenomenon. So I'll throw those out there as the kind of, as the axes of the discussion.
I could respond to that briefly, but Ed, did you want to go? Was there something? Okay, just briefly, another quote from another book, but I think it's this book on, well, I won't. But there's this quotation I thought was interesting. He's talking about the Middle Ages. And what we call the Middle Ages isn't the real Middle Ages. It's the version that the Renaissance had of the Middle Ages. And he says the Middle Ages were not the Dark Ages, as the myth would have us believe, as a long transition between the world's various antiquities and diverse modernities. The Middle Ages functions historically. The medieval ages functions historically depending on which age you're in after that. Like modernity, there are alternate modernities, especially in Africa, where you see like artists who were not allowed in the academy in Paris in the 19th century or early 20th century, which was where modernism really kicked off in the arts, right? But there was a movement, a modernist movement in Africa, which was not tracked by the big Western thinkers about art history. And I looked at some of the art, it was fascinating. There were impressionist styled paintings, but they were rather than Caucasian, fleshy Caucasian women in the water, they were Black women with, exotic headdresses, and it just, but it was done in an impressionist style. So it really sort of startled me because I realized, oh, there are other modernities, alter modernities, as this art historian was trying to track. And there may be alter integralities, integrals. I don't know how you talk about this. Aperspectivals. I would claim we're in the midst of this right now, as the first order transitions to a second order. Maybe some have transitioned to a third order, and we're all coexisting in these very fragile, stressed out communities. But there's a mention that I think that was made in about Bellah and his take, and I don't know if this is accurate or not. Some commentator was saying that the Axial Age was a sort of turning point where a world rejection occurred on a larger scale than had ever been before, which is very different in religion, pre-axial religion. It doesn't seem to be that the pre-axial religions, the shamanic religions, were rejecting the world at all. So I just think that's another feature of this landscape we're all trying to work with, that I just wanted to add to what you said, TJ. Thanks.
Like what you just said, John, I wanted to, it's been banging around in my skull for a while. Osman brings this up in his chapter as well, but I just want to contrast it with, I know it'll strike you all as odd, Gapser. For Gapser, there's no religion prior to what we call the Axial Age, or what these folks are calling the Axial Age. Prior to that, there is no religion. There is strict there's observance. There's things that we, from our vantage point, call religious, but that doesn't make them a religion in that sense, because religion for Gapser is a manifestation of the mental structure of consciousness. It becomes systematized. It becomes a system, if you will. It's actually organized. There's credos, there's rules, there's this, there's that. This is one of the things that Eisenstadt is wrestling with. All of a sudden, people are trying to find a way to keep society from imploding. And so they're coming up with new ways of doing it. And these are ways that are foreign to the we'll call it the traditional ways of dealing with it. And that's why these, one of the other, this just struck me now, one of the other concepts, if you will, that most of these writers are stumbling across is evolution. They all believe very strongly in evolution. I'm not saying there's no evolutionary tendencies or anything like that, don't get me wrong. But if you buy two deeply into let's call it a Darwinian or quasi-Darwinian understanding of evolution, you're going to trip all over yourself at some point. This was another point that Gapser went to great lengths to go, that's not what I'm talking about. It is not that at all. And he wanted to stress, and I think rightfully so, these quantum leaps, these jumps, these discontinuous, he called them mutations, because on one side of it, it's this way, and on the other side, it's another way. But coming back to the comment that I made about the Anthropocene in the show on German TV, it only looks sudden from a particular vantage point. It's certainly not sudden for the people going through it, because how many of us in our lifetime will actually experience the shift, quote unquote, the shift? We, like you just said, you know, there's a lot of, it's not like there's different integralities, but we're all going to experience it to a different, let's say, degree of intensity or to a degree of awareness of somehow. And we see, yeah, there's something happening, but I don't know if we see the completed picture. And I don't know if anybody actually could say at any one point, oh yeah, now it's happened. We finally made that step. I can guarantee for that, because we've been stumbling through this all along. But for some reason, when we look out in the world, we all tend to agree. I think all 5 of us that are sitting here all tend to agree, yeah, we're very mental rational in how we deal with the world, you know. But when did that happen? It was, you know, for us, it is a given. But it happened at some point that really that was the dominant way, or the general way, or the more accepted way of doing it, you know. So, you know, transitional periods are always tough in that regard, trying to nail those kinds of things down. So when I come back to, you know, the viewpoints that TJ brought up, I have to say, well, all of the above. In a sense, it is all of those things. It is Jasper's reaction. It is a time of social and political upheaval, and it is a shift from oral tradition to right. They all apply, and they're all valid, but none of them exclusively. And I think that's the trap that most of us mental rational folks fall into. This came out very, very clear in our Castro discussion recently, when we were talking about the clip that you had put up about Steiner's 12 ways of seeing the world, and everybody goes, yeah, but isn't one of them, you know, shouldn't we get to one of them somehow? Because we just have that desire to say this one's the right one. And it's really different. It's a challenge to say, well, not just one of them. Betty might take this to a, you know, an extreme, but or Steiner, when he goes, yeah, it's all of them. You actually have to do all of them at once. And then I know that my first reaction was, no, I can't do that. You're asking a little too much right now for me to do all of them. But the more I've engaged with this, you start realizing, boy, we do bounce around that goes a whole hell of a lot. I've heard myself saying things and I'm going, oh man, that's monadism if I've ever heard it. You know, where did that come from? And then over here, well, that was pretty realist, and you know, it was you know, I start catching this, and this really came across one of the consequences of reading Betty was there's not a chapter in his book, not one, even whether it's about the 12 ways of seeing the world or even the introduction one, that does not mention Goethe. And I mean, this book is just loaded with it. And I'm just going, holy mackerel, I've been avoiding this all this long. So
Goethe, yeah.
This is sort of Safransky's short biography of Goethe. And what struck me, I've only read the first couple of chapters of it. That man is all over the place. He's up here, he's in this one. Then now I know what Betty's talking about. I hadn't even, you know, got into the depth of it, because it's not just that he's looking for himself. which is all biographies about the search for whomever that is themselves. But it's not that he's bouncing around. It's that he's gleaning from, he's picking up on. You can see how very slowly he's kind of forming himself into himself, whomever he is, and he was at great odds with the society in which he found himself. There was a certain feeling in the Rococo and in the that late 18th century. How does a person appear to the world, and what's acceptable and unacceptable? And he was always running this very fine line between what are you allowed and what can you get away with. So these are all the factors that I heard you mentioning, John and TJ. I think it's more this and that, and the challenge is understanding how that and part works. At least for me, that's what I'm saying, because I wrestle with that a lot. Because I have the feeling when I do that, I'm just bouncing around. Well, maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm actually trying to pick up things along the way to put together into some kind of coherent whole. And this is what I got out of Eisenstadt's chapter. There's all this stuff bouncing around, and I don't have a way to get it all together yet. That's where I found the sympathy with him in this chapter, even though I probably don't agree with the conclusions that he comes to. But he's going through that same kind of process. That's what I saw.
I'm going to have to end up circling back to Goethe myself. Spengler, Hegel, philosophy of history. Oh, Goethe. Okay, Nietzsche. Oh, Goethe.
I want to bring in, because of my influence of the chapter I read and from other things just in my personal experience, and it's just a position I just want to put forth that is a jumping off point. I'm trying to jump off. The issue of power, and I mean power, just how power is being used individually and then in groups, because all these things that we're talking about, I may be, they're just, for me, there seems to be a thread, the use of power. That's what I found interesting about that chapter, is how power and affecting behavior, how somebody's behavior affects me, which that means power, they're having power over me, and how that starts from the mundane, and then it gets, it gets built up into these structures and that whole thing. I would like to hear everybody kind of speak to that point, because I think one of the things right now that could be a significant thing is a lot of people, because of fear, don't feel empowered to deal with a similar turning point that we're talking about in history, if that makes sense.
I'm wondering if I could, sorry, go ahead, TJ.
Oh, good.
It's maybe in relation to what you're saying, Michael. So I was struck, these authors, they're talking about the old axial age, right? The one that happened 2,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago. Mostly, and agree that Jaspers has this modern one. And at the end of the book, they're sort of struggling with, well, maybe something else is going on now. But they really have not a lot to say about it. All of their ways of dealing with the future is to look at the structures of the past and then say, well, they'll continue on into the future. And of course, the problem that we're struggling with today is that something else is happening. It's not just about the old structures and cycles coming back, and there's something else that's emerging, and it's hard to understand exactly what's going on. And so, but I actually think that in a way, they actually lay out in the book several elements that are relevant to the issue of what is coming out. So one of the things I found really interesting is in Whitrock's chapter. I get long thing about 5 pathways to this sort of analysis of all the things. In fact, I was looking up, trying to find, there's a quote by Lauren Isley where he talks about the theoretical constructs that we make and how we have to be careful of not believing them too much. But I can't find the quote. It's one I used to have, but I can't find it right now. But one of the things Whitrock says is there are, where do these, he makes this link between the socio-geographical structures of societies and the change in cosmos, ontology, these kinds of things. But he says it wasn't that there are all these lots of little tribes running around. It's there were pre-existing fledgling states. He doesn't call them states, but there's something already in place when these things came into being. There was threat from neighboring regions, and then there was a decentralizing influence that happened. And the emergence of these massive changes in society only happened, didn't come into on top of stuff that was already pre-existing without an external push into something different. So I think in a way, this is what we're talking about. They didn't have Gebser's understanding of the world. They talk about, in fact, I think it's Martin who uses the term second order thinking, Johnny. So even though they're stuck in first order thinking for much of the time, they're struggling with the sort of awareness of these other things. They talk about reasoning, which is a kind of second order idea. It's buried in there, but it's there. And so they didn't have Gebser's idea of integral, which is really, integral obviously has age-old roots as an idea, but the way Gebser developed that idea, he was looking at finding what is new in emergence, what is different about what's going on now, and I think a careful reading of what they've done gives some clues about that, even though they themselves miss the point to some extent. So I'm not sure that really answers your question, your issue, Michael. But I think it is about this turn towards something that we're trying to find, and it has to do with what Johnny, you call the second axial age, which I'm not entirely happy with as a term, but I think we're talking about this idea of, and of course the pandemic that we've got is going to have, it's not just, I don't think it's a 9/11 event. I mean, it is in a way, because the 9/11 event changed the way we understand world cultures, right? And this is changing the way we understand.
It's destabilizing.
No, but it's not just that. It's changing the way we understand how the world is connected. So hey, things in China, 4 weeks ago or 5 weeks ago, nothing to do with me. Well, all of a sudden, it's very much to do with me. So the world has these connections in it that are absolutely massive and deep now, and can't be, so, but it's not just destabilization, there's restabilization going on. And that's what, of course, we're worried about, is how it's going to restabilize.
And I understand that's a good point, Jeffrey. I'm just saying the mass of people are only focused on the destabilization. And I want to kind of articulate, nuance what I was trying to say. There's this view to how power is to abuse it. And there's some truth to that, but I think if we take that too much to heart, then we don't learn how to use the power we have. And this is where ethics in that section I won, of challenging the king's power and getting a critical thinking and reflection of the use of how power is being used, even from kingship, and challenging that. And what I take your point. I like the way you said restabilization, but I'm focused on how I walk in my day and how people in my surrounding area will feel destabilized. I try to encourage when I talk to them how to respond to the destabilization to get to the point that I think is fair that you say. But in the midst of that, people don't have any training of how or way of responding to just the knee-jerk reaction. Oh, what the shit? I got to go buy toilet paper. That's just absurd to me.
But it has to do with what Ed was talking about, isn't it, Ed? I'm confused who said what now, but about this idea of not one explanation, but there are many explanations.
Yes.
You have to accept. So everybody, I mean, the majority of people are still on this one explanation thing.
Yes, right.
And in a way, this pandemic is teaching us as a society that isn't going to work anymore, because you can't think about the pandemic as being just a virus that's going to get me. You have to think about the next person across and working together.
I agree, Jeffrey.
I'm on
track with you.
Yeah,
I'm on
the
track
whole
with you.
idea of slowing the virus by social distancing is a second order way of thinking about a virus. And it's teaching it, the lesson to us worldwide. This is going to have a restabilizing effect after the pandemic, which
that's the whole
a positive move forward into a new kind of way. It'll take time, and it'll take more than one event to get there.
Right.
But something is going on, and it's not, and it's big. It's not, you know.
Yes, right.
I was just going to interject really quick about there's power exercised when things are stable, and then there's power in response to crisis situations.
Exactly.
Sometimes, you know, that of course that changes the dynamic quite a bit. Go ahead. Somebody was going to.
I was going to leap in there, but did you complete that thought, TJ? Because I thought that was.
Yeah, I was going to go somewhere else with it, but
please. Okay, go ahead. I'll catch up. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So again, so if I was going to cheat, and if I was going to go back into the deficient rational and ask everybody, yeah, I threw out 3 keys, and of course the answer is all of the above. But if I was going to say, well, no, let's go press that a little bit and rank those 3 things, where would you put them? And I would put the social and political upheaval first. I mean, these things are happening in life. These crises are coming through. These things that are feeding mutations when you go from one structure of consciousness to another, as Gebser would say. And I think that sets in train. Of course, I can make an argument of the other ones as well, but I think, again, in the pandemic, just the ways in which it's challenging the previous thought structures. And we might not come to a place where we're like, oh, we're mindful more of these things. Globalization, you know, that the G word has been with us for a while, you know, and there's the reactions to it. There's the backlash against what they think is a too connected world, and why can't they keep those germs in China? And then there's the realization that we've tied these things together in so many different ways that who would think of trying to unravel it all? So it quickly becomes a two-way street.
That's great. I'm going to try to. I have to take a deep breath. My feet are on the floor.
Excellent.
My feet is in the chair.
Excellent.
I can feel a little buzzing in my hands. A little. It feels like my torso. I feel a lot of heat and warmth and coldness and excitement. And there's an element of fear about what I might say. Could be stupid. There's also an excitement about what I might learn, which is holding that fear in a different way. So, but it's always a risk. You never know what's going to come out of your mouth. And you don't know how anyone's going to respond to it until they respond to it, right? So, having said all that, you mentioned power, TJ, is different in a stable and an unstable system. You didn't say that exactly, I'm sort of paraphrasing it. But I think the whole idea of what you were offering earlier about Michael, about the power over me. And then there's also, you didn't say this, but there's the power within me. And that relationship between the power over me and the power within me. And that very deep master-slave dynamic, which Hegel paid a lot of attention to, and how we're going to deal with that master-slave dynamic of the power within and the power over. And I think Hegel famously said, the slave can do without the master. The master cannot do without the slave. And we're living in a world of where there are interests in maintaining stratification and inequality to maintain their power. This is getting more and more centralized in fewer people. The vast majority of people who have created the conditions through their creativity, this kind of accumulated wealth that is being used in maintaining stratification and inequality. So the masters rely upon the creativity of the slaves. I think the slaves is trying to wake up that there may be other alternate modernities, that we're transitioning from first order to second order cultures. And I think that's been mentioned by previously. I'm thinking that it's a possibility, and I think we've started to create a kind of vibe around the idea that communities that are freed up from the fight, flight, freeze economics, where we have to fight for survival, if there were communities that were freed up from that, they could create conditions for working with existential problems in a very different way. And I think that is worth tuning into and resonating with. And I believe that we're doing this right now. It's probably so new that we're not even aware that we're doing it. But we're going meta in very, I think, interesting ways. And I believe most of us go meta all the time. We're just not paying attention to it. I'm drawing upon something that Benita Roy, an interesting theorist, she wrote a paper on 6 ways of going meta. I would recommend it. I think I posted it once. I don't know if anyone responded to it, but I thought it might make a good roundtable discussion. I'm tying this in with something that Ed was saying about studying Betty, and he's becoming aware of the idealist, the realist, the materialist within himself, that he was like saying, where did that come from? And he was noting it in his own behavior. And I think, where did that come from? It's an indication that he's going meta to his own internal process and the external behaviors that he's exhibiting and observing in others. So I think that when we hear people tell your story and then they all of a sudden pause and say, this kind of thing always happens to me. And then they go on to continue the story. In that little moment, they were making a meta comment upon their storytelling. And they were detecting a pattern. And I believe this is what Ed was doing. He's detecting patterns. And I believe this is what all of us are doing. We are pattern detectors, and we are pattern makers. We create together a niche an environment in which we can survive, hopefully thrive, and also that environment shapes us and we shape that environment. And just to go backtrack a little bit in our own sort of explorations here, thinking about the spear, the bow and arrow, the trap, all of those, there's a history of that technology. A shared attention was required to produce that technology. And we see the purpose behind all of those different technological manifestations is the same, to catch game. So the purpose of the trap, the purpose of the bow and arrow, the purpose of the spear is all the same, but those are different manifestations, and there's a direction. You don't see a trap before you see a spear. So there's the spear, the bow and arrow, the trap, all have the same purpose. It requires social organization. It requires shared attention. It requires a capacity for pattern detection, pattern making, the study of the exquisite attunement to animals that you want to have, and your attunement with the group of people that you're affiliating with, and you want to be sure that they are well fed. All of that is a part of the organization of our societies. And this is very, very ancient. And our ability to entrain with one another, we look in someone's eyes, we can get a feel through their gesture and the tone of their voice and their rhythm about what's going on with them inside, what their internal frames of reference might be. We might share, but we also can, there's lots of wiggle room for each of us to make communications to one another that we still have to interpret in our own unique way. So I'm just putting that all out there. I hope we can go meta in more creative ways. And I believe we have the opportunity now to do just that, because we have access to so much more information than we've ever had before. And we have to parse it in a way that can make enough sense so that we can then create meaning together. Because just as I quoted Anne Swindler, quoting that expert, the African peoples traditionally, they couldn't understand living in a world that was free of obligations to others. That's not part of their, the way they've operated traditionally. And I think that's some of the culture clashes that we're experiencing, because and I think that's something that we're waking up to in our, atomistic sort of winner takes all, highly competitive, competing over scant resources. All of that's bullshit, by the way. It's not true. It's just the way that we operate. We've been trained to operate and think. So I think that whole idea of creating stratification and inequality to maintain power elites, I think that's crumbling. And what are we going to do instead of that? Well, I think it has a lot to do with how effective we are at going meta. So thanks for giving me this chance to rehearse all of this. And I think there's something about the garments that we take on and we take off, the stories we tell around the campfire, the well-lit path, and we all carry that light, the prayer, which I'm embodying right now, and that noisy radio with the search for the noise and the signal. So I think that the metaphors that we use are going to be very important for how we collectively go meta. And this is something that we've always done. Thanks.
Well, I also, TJ, did you want to go? I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to add to it, I think, and what I feel all this coming together is actually challenging the institution that has grown from ancient times of more and more people gathering together you know, larger groups, and having to organize in this institution of power that came online, you know, the kings and the pharaohs and stuff, to try to take care of business. You know, it is the institution of the way we use power is breaking down, so that, I don't know if this is from Martin Luther King, but a matter of not having power over, but sharing power. Because we can't deny, we got to start getting real. Power is real. It's how we use it with each other. It's not something we should, we've spent a lifetime in conflict with power, some of it rightfully so, I get it. But just to try to think that you get rid of the kings, you're going to get rid of any of us having a source or wanting to use power. I mean, I just think in terms of being a parent and being parented. I kind of bring it down that when I was parented, I had a certain, you know, my parents had power over me and they left an imprint on me. Well, I had to put in check some of the ways they used that power when I became a parent. Thank God I was open to it, you know, and not necessarily blaming my parents, but just critical thinking, rethinking, and my own father gave me permission to challenge him, even though he didn't like it. I mean, what king likes being challenged sometimes? But you know, so I hate to keep coming back to this issue of power, because powers of whatever on a different level is shifting. How we're relating to the power, even existentially, I guess. Thank you.
No, you keep coming back to power. It's a very important part of the mix. And I agree 100% with where John was going with. I think one of our early conversations years ago, and we just decided that we really kind of need a new language. At the end of the day, it's just a matter of changing the metaphors. Because I was going to push back the historian, not quite a curmudgeon, but a historian, going to push back on the axial age. If we're looking at power structures, you went from a divine kingship and a court and kind of, you know, centralize as much as you can centralize in the communications of the day, and you ended up at the end of the period, if you're going from 800 to 200 BCE, you end up at the end of the period with these universal state empires. You end up with an even greater concentration of military force. You end up with an even greater regulation of the economy than you started with. And Jaspers himself pointed that out, that you know, he thought the axial age as a whole was a failure, because that's where it ended up, the transcendent and the, you know, the new spiritual traditions notwithstanding. So and I bring that up because the Baskin and Bondarenko article, which I threw out there also, they're insistent, and I see some of where they're coming from, that the second axial age was the modern period, that there was multiple axialities that Eisenstadt was studying, and that the same kinds of shifts, which ended up in multiple modernities, which is, you know, the West, but then also China, Japan, certain African countries, India, all came to the modern world in different paths. So there was multiple modernities. But again, we're going from the kings and the trading empires of the early modern period, and we're ending up with the nation states that fought the world wars, and that, you know, that we have today. And so in shifting from that, Alexander Wendt says we're looking at a world state, and whatever that means, you know. And in a sense, it's like, so these shifts in history, these axial shifts, if you want to call them that, centralize more than they decentralize. And I want to throw that out as kind of a caution, that if we don't change the language around that, we're ending up in worse places than when we started.
So you feel this engagement with language and trying to, like, I think we're enacting kind of that. Would you agree, TJ?
Oh yeah, no, we're trying. And yeah. I was just you know, the Beams and Struts magazine archive that's still around, the Chrysalis, the Rebel Wisdom. You know, we're one of several groups that are trying to, you know,
engage the use of language in
Right.
new ways, and in that, possibly, I'm just saying it this way, create a new language or just a new relationship of how we're working with it.
a new relationship to how we're looking at social and political structures, how
Okay.
we're looking at economics. Uh, here's where I try to avoid bringing up Jeremy Lentz, the patterning instinct.
I wish I'm all for you bringing it up. I'm all
Okay.
for it.
I'm really looking, John, if we only get to, on the forum, discuss chapters 20 and 21, the last two chapters of the book, I mean, it's nothing that we don't already kind of know, nothing that we've not already been discussing here, but he writes it so eloquently, just putting his fingers on the problems, and then the change of language and change of metaphors. I really like your opinion on that, but we'll do that, talk about that later.
Yes, I'm reading it and enjoying it very much. I agree. It's very well written, and it's nothing that we haven't already covered this territory. He's in the same territory.
Mhm.
Yeah, I love that idea. Let's make that happen.
Yeah.
I guess. Oh, go, Jeffrey.
No, just a really quick comment. I like that idea that axial shifts tend to centralize rather than decentralize. I think it's why I'm so nervous around the idea of axial, like a second axial age, because, anyway, we've talked about that. But
I think there's something about a centralizing of making a group of people around some sort of essence. The postmodern is really against that. I think Jeremy Lent does a pretty good description of how the postmodern has rejected universalizing tendencies of the modern, and the the kind of imperialism modern practice of going into different cultures, plucking them, stealing all their resources, and then imposing a grid on them, where they had to get rid of the language that they used. It was made illegal in some cases, and then they all had to learn the language of those in authority. So language is a unifier, it's a divider, it can destroy, it can heal. So language is, I think I mentioned this earlier, it's the most advanced tool we have for modeling. Also our most powerful intoxicating drug. If someone says something nice to you, it can feel really good. If someone says something nasty to you, you can feel terrible for days, for years. And sometimes the person who says something nice to you and the person who says something nasty about you is the same person. For some of that's mom and dad. But I can still remember my mother when she was proud of me and the sound of her voice. I get that warm, fuzzy feeling all over. And I think that's just that's that memory. That memory is so powerful and so destructive in us, because we do also need to forget. It's important that we have amnesia. If we remember everything, we can't function at all. And I'm just going to tell you a personal anecdote. I was working with a woman. In those days I was training to be a therapist, and I abandoned it. But I think it was for very good reasons, because I feel like most therapy is working at the wrong level. And I'm not saying it's not necessary, and I'm not saying there aren't very, very good therapists, but I was working with
You make a good therapist, John.
Oh yeah, well, I'm doing something similar in these convocations here, where I try to pick up on linguistic patterns and try to ask questions about the language a person's actually using, rather than giving them my interpretation of what they're saying. Oh yeah, I hear you, I got you. And then I paraphrase it and I make up my own thing, and then I project it onto you. But anyway, but I'm also not just interested in the individual. I'm interested in the group and how we take the what an individual offers and make sense of it. I think you were doing this earlier, Michael, when you said you got something from Jeffrey's garment metaphor, because you're saying we're all sitting naked around this campfire. We need some clothes. We need some garments. We need and probably someone to design some really interesting garments so we can all feel a sense of warmth and safety and also identification with one another if we're all wearing a similar garment. This is very, very old, a way of creating social identities. And we're still doing it every day. That's what the fashion industry does. But I'm sort of getting a little off track. Oh yeah, this woman, she came to me. She jumped off of a building. I can't remember, it was the 11th floor. Impossible that she survived, but that she did. Broke every bone in her body. A long, painful recovery. But she walked into the consultant room. She said, "Can I smoke?" And I said, "Sure." She opened a window and she pulled out a pack of cigarettes and started smoking. And I wanted to figure out what she wanted to happen in our sessions. And she told me this. And she said she doesn't remember anything, but that the doorman in her building who found her body, called the emergency room, he says that they had a conversation, that she was talking after this leap, 11 flights. And so her thing was, I want to remember what happened. She's had reports from other people about what happened that she wanted to remember. So she basically wanted to have a first-person account of this event. And alarm bells went off in my system because I had to ask a question about, is this ecological for her to remember? So I asked her, "What did you have for breakfast this morning?" And she said, "I don't have breakfast." I said, "Okay, well, what did you have for dinner last night?" She told me what she had for dinner. I said, "And how do you know that?" And she sort of thought that was an odd question, but she sort of had to find how do you differentiate a fact from a factoid or a story? And I started to realize, okay, so she can remember what she had for dinner the night before, and I think this is an accurate report. But how are we going to reconstruct a memory for this tragic event in her life, which was so traumatizing, that her nervous system may be protecting her from by not remembering it? So this is my big question. I've asked it over and over again in my own behavior and the behavior of others about what we forget, what we remember that we forgot, what we forgot that we want to remember, what we never want to remember under any circumstances. And there are some things that I'm pretty sure we can never remember, even if we wanted to, because our biology prevents it. But I do think there's our biology and our culture the boundary between biology and culture is extremely fluid, especially right now. And I believe our culture clearly can trump our biology through medical intervention, through the diets that we have, through the air that we breathe, through the water that we drink. We're impacting our biology in incredibly dramatic ways. That's what I think the whole Anthropocene is about. So at any rate, another anecdote, and then I'll shut up. A woman I came to a therapist I much admire. His name is Milton Erickson. He was a great hypnotherapist. She said she had a dream. And the dream, she said, there was a gift that she was going to give. And at the end of the dream, one of the characters in the dream said, "Remember this dream." And then she woke up remembering that she had a dream, but she can't remember and that there was a gift, but she can't remember what the gift was. So Milton Erickson, brilliant genius that he was, invited her to go into a trance state. And in the trance state, he asked her unconscious mind to locate that dream and to remember what the gift was. And she did. And she was able to come out of the trance and recall it. And it was a box of paints. But I find that very fascinating because I think through the use of trance, altered states of consciousness, which is biological, we go in and out of trance all day long. We have circadian rhythms, ultradian rhythms. These ultradian rhythms every 90 minutes, a period of rest and activity, are required for your nervous system to function. Unfortunately, we don't let that 20 minutes of rest activity happen. We're active too long and our nervous systems are breaking down because we can't, and where our memories are very flawed. So I think these relationships between rest, activity, ultradian rhythms, circadian rhythms, other kinds of rhythms, and our nervous system's capacity to remember what we need to remember, to forget what we need to forget. It's really crucial. And I think our systems, our nervous systems, are noisier now than they have ever been in the history of our species. We are very, very noisy. I speak for myself. I go to bed at night and I can just feel hundreds of mixed messages going through my sensorium, which I'm sure is having a huge influence on the kind of dreams that I have. But part of my practice has been social dreaming. If you can remember even a little bit of what you dreamed the night before, you may be making a huge contribution to yourself, but also to how you hold your imagination and the imaginations of others. Because I can only assume that, like, what would Whitman say? What belongs to me as good belongs to you. We are the body electric. And, you know, I think that we are under enormous stress, but those of us who have the capacity to hold, you know, memory and theory and evolve new practices, I think, and take meta perspective, to have feelings about one's feelings, to have thoughts about one's thoughts, to have thoughts about feeling, and how the cognitive and the affective zones are extremely fluid and influential. There's no such thing as cognition without affect. We don't know what to value without feeling. So anyway, that's my spiel, and I applaud all of us for making this enormous effort to study this text together. And wow, I think we're doing a good job. We're sharing attention, I think, exquisitely well, showing a lot of affection for one another and curiosity about each other's process. I hope we do more of this and do it even better. Thank you.
Something you said about almost, I'm paraphrasing, culture having a nervous system or a biological system of its own, and I'm going to try to tie this together. So one of Jaspers' points, which was pretty strong, was this struggle and this overcoming of struggle between mythos and logos, and the overcoming of mythos with logos. And just in the points that you were making just now, John, I'm thinking, so you have myth, and I think, it was Mircea Eliade who was talking about the terror of history in traditional societies. They don't want to accumulate all of this historical memory. They have, and not that it's a static way of thinking, but they have a dream time or a prototypical situation, and that's where the ethical component of the society comes from, and it's being faithful to that. We would call it stagnant in our enlightened modern sensibilities, as opposed to a culture of history and mental structure, which I had pointed out a couple of sessions ago, where we're trying to remember everything. And I mean everything, because we've got specialists in every castle building and every rock that we turn over. And it's kind of like the frenetic, where you get to the point of frenetic nature where you can combine, where you can collect all of this information, and especially in the electronic age. It's very interesting how we've kind of traded off one kind of stability for another more reckless kind of stability, if that's making sense. But go ahead, Ed. You had no. Yeah, so nervous systems of culture, which is the point that you brought up that I found really interesting just now. So what comes after logos?
Yes, I think this is the big $1 million question about, we all, I think because we're students of Gebser and we've shared our enthusiasm for him and in a lot of integral theory and theorists, we can look at the deficient mental. I can say deficient mental and y'all get a certain vibe. You know what I'm talking about. And when other people use that, I go, oh yeah, I got it. That's because we share Gebser. And I think the deficient mental, though, is something that's actual in people's behavior. I hear experts talking, as many of the experts here, and I could tell they're talking to other experts about their expertise, and they have a huge investment in that expertise being recognized. So they take a stand, but they also don't want to get shot at, you know, because they're schooled in critique. And you know, if you're critiqued by the wrong person, you don't get tenure. So I think those affiliations are kind of futile, and Jeffrey would know this more than anybody. But I think there are great benefits for protecting knowledge and preserving it and creating traditions, and there are high risks in shooting messengers who are offering something alternative to that. And I think that's where we're moving from a deficient mental to an efficient mental. Actually, efficient mental and deficient mental, I think, are held very closely by all the experts that I observe. And on my own behavior, I'm aware of it as well. And I think that's so primal in us. When we're in any emergency situation, the question we have is, who's in charge? And we want someone to be in charge in those emergency situations. When everything's going fine, it doesn't matter to us so much because it's usually who's in charge is fairly invisible. They may be doing such a good job that everything's going just fine. So I think there is a consensus, though, that we're in a very unstable situation. And I think that's when we start to recognize the rational is important, but there's something else besides the rational that we need to be paying exquisite attention to. And I think that's not so easy for a lot of us who've been in our factory model educations, and we've diagnosed this before, and I think accurately too. But I think there's a whole lot of work has been done in balancing the left brain and the right brain, even though it's a bit of a parody or a caricature perhaps, because it's much more complicated than left and right. But I think that's going on with our limbic system, with that old reptile brain and the nervous system in an environment which is changing all the time. So I think that that's something other than the rational is, I believe, a form of transcendence that's probably very postmodernists are not fond of this idea, because I think there's so much invested in not having a final cause, that teleology is held in ill repute. That's why I think Kripal is so interesting, and a lot of the people who are doing weird studies is because these anomalies don't fit within the paradigm. Well, just shoot the person who notices those anomalies, and we can just sweep it under the rug and forget about it and move on. But that's not happening now. There are too many anomalies, and we can't shut that many people up. And I think that's when we're seeing a shift happening. I'm reluctant to call it a paradigm shift because I'm not so sure what paradigms are anymore. But I think there's how we hold the transcendent and the immanent is the concrete and the abstract. We do this very differently from culture to culture. And from person to person within the culture, there's probably huge variation. And there's some persons within a culture, they know what the paradigm, or they know what the controlling metaphors are, but they still come up with different ones. And they find communities within that larger culture. There are subcultures underground that have occult knowledge perhaps, and they they continue to flourish in some ways because it breaks out in these emergencies. So I think that may be happening to us all. Thanks.
And to counter my own point about centralization, the internet as the ultimate, at least the attempt of decentralizing, is also going to, it kind of shifts the communication, nexus of this. I'll never forget a professor I had, early modern history. What's the difference between John Huss and Martin Luther? Both of them wanted to reform the church. Both of them had this, thing about the authority of the church. Well, one came after the printing press. One came after it was possible to just disseminate his message and get his message out. And that was like the crucial difference between the two. So that.
I think your allergy to paradigm is probably good here, because if you go back to Kuhn, he was talking about scientific revolutions. He wasn't talking about general culture and general society. And the term is used well beyond where it should be used, so.
That's right. That's right.
That's
So
like the term codependent is overused.
Right. And I think there's an interdependence of the difference between, I jotted this down, ties of unequal interdependence. This I get from Swindler, talking about Africa and its absorption of the modern and its spin on the modern, that we are interdependent and our interdependence is unequal.
Mm-hmm.
Look at a parent and a child.
Yeah.
There's equality, but it's not, well, there's interdependency, but it's not, but I think that gets amplified in all the institutions that we're operating within. Mm-hmm. And it's a failure to acknowledge, I think, certainly living in New York in late capitalist society, amplified dramatically, how there are friendships and people do care about one another, but they compete ruthlessly with everyone. And everyone in New York is trying to sell you something, even your best friend. It's very disheartening. You're sitting there and you think, oh, this person really likes me. And then they try to do a sales pitch on you. And you realize everyone is doing this. And I've been guilty of doing it too. It's called instrumentalizing other people. And it's pervasive, it's hardwired. You don't have much of a choice about it if you want to survive in this society. But is it changeable? I think it is. And I think crises such as the one we're in now are bringing to our attention how fragile we are, how interdependent we are. Not codependent, interdependent. But that our interdependence is not always equal. Mm. There's some who have a huge investment in keeping it stratified. And I think we need to find out healthy ways of being unequally interdependent and unhealthy ways of stratifying and creating so that we can't share our knowledge. And I think that's the tragedy of late capitalism. It gets to the point where sharing knowledge is obstructed because it's not in your interest to share knowledge. How are you going to make a profit if this is widely distributed and everyone has some of it? This is why we're running in this panic attack. The pharmaceuticals and the medical industry is like, well, how can we co-opt this and create something that's going to make more profits for us? And there's some who are blowing the whistle and say, no, this is free. Everyone gets tested and it's free of charge. And if you need service and if you need to be taken care of, you're not going to lose your house or your family or we're going to find a way of paying your mortgage. This is something brand new. I don't know that it will happen. Any policies will emerge out of it. But I think that somebody that is now being talked about openly is a clear instance, I think, of something that we're moving out of a first order to a second order, a potential second order culture.
One of those things that makes UBI not an exercise in sheer ridiculousness that other people would love to, oh, no, it just can't work. It's like, oh, well, what if we have no choice? What if your consumer society is based on, but you have no consumers? What are you going to do?
So that's a good note to end because it's coming up to the hour. I think.
Oh my goodness.
I love the way you finished that, rounded that up, Connie. So, and I think we did a good. I think I felt it was a really interesting discussion. It carried me forward in my thinking. So.
Me too. And what happens next? Maybe you gave us a clue, TJ, with that, looking up a chapter here. You said this Lent book. Maybe we can do another meetup around that in the not too distant future. I would love to follow up on that.
Yeah. Ed, you can still skip it for Lent, but it's, I think you'd find it, that was Ed's joke, that wasn't mine.
I know.
I thought he was worried about Goethe.
Save your energy for.
I'm not worried about Goethe. He can take care of himself. But
I think Goethe should be on our list too. We'll find something we could read together. He's a giant.
Also,
He really is.
Have, it's like you just said, if you have a couple of chapters or something focused, that I'm not averse to anything. Don't get me wrong. It's just that my day only has 24 hours in it, and I'm at an age where I like to sleep a couple of them. There was a time I didn't care, but now it's that's some of the advice that we were given over here on this side of the Atlantic is sleep's good for this whole thing. It helps you not get bored when you're social distancing, because nobody over here, if you listen to virologists, this is what I find so interesting. I don't know what you guys are being told where you are, but, we're being told they expect that 80% of the population is going to get this. The only thing that Germany, I'll just put it since I get mostly German, and that's one of the reasons they're closing borders and things. They're not closing them. People are still going across. There are people who in France who work in Germany. They come over and work. It's just that if you don't really have to be out and about, you should think twice about it. That's the idea, because the idea of what happened in Italy, the reason they got hit real hard for two reasons. They were not expecting it. That was one. They had thousands of illegal Chinese immigrants working in their garment sweat shops.
Wow.
Yes, who brought it with them. And so they got overwhelmed. And what everyone else is trying to do is not get overwhelmed. People are going to get it. Lots of folks are going to get it. But if everybody gets it at once, we've got a problem. If we can somehow stretch it out a little bit, it makes all the difference in the world. I read recently, some people, I'll give you, the downside is some people have said in the United States, at least 1 million people are going to come down with this and need to be in intensive care facilities. Well, there's only 75,000 intensive care beds in the United States. Well, you got a whole bunch of people you don't know what to go with. If you listen to the folks in Italy, the ones that are confronting it, they're simply letting people die because they can't get to it. They've got too much to handle. So it's one of those, it's not a matter of, we've decided in the good sense of neoliberal economics, to adjust our markets somehow. It's just that there's some things you can do and there's some things that you can't.
Right.
And if you're overwhelmed by something, you can't do a lot of things that you would like to do.
And cutting interest rates is going to have no effect on this virus.
That has nothing to do with anything. But what amazes me is that you still hear, in spite of everything else, about all of the turbulence on the world, on the stock markets. Why haven't they stopped trading? If they're worried about it, stop it. You don't have to.
They did shortly this morning. They stopped it for 2 hours.
20 minutes, whatever.
20 minutes? Oh, okay.
That's my point. They will continue. We'll set it out for a moment. And what fascinates me more than anything else, we also know that 95% of all stock trades are done by computers. It has nothing to do with, does an algorithm panic? I don't think so.
Right.
No, it's just that ultimate, certain criteria are met and certain, decisions are made by that software. But we're still, and this is what really aggravates me, is that we're talking about it as if human beings were involved. and they're not. You know, we're
Right.
being told something above and beyond everything else.
We're making yam roots.
Yes. Yeah. And that's really the downside of all of it. That's what keeps. I'm hoping somewhere deep in my heart of hearts that we'll be able to get over all of that and get beyond that. But it still shows how deeply entrenched. This goes back to what Michael said also about power structure. There's a real big power structure involved there. And it is operating now as it was before, as if there were no. It's using this as part of.
Yes,
You know.
and we are being hypnotized.
Well, of course, we're being
watch
told
we watch
day in and
CBS,
day out.
yeah, and they have a protocol, and they are describing certain features of the landscape in certain ways that go under the radar and get into your unconscious and can make you feel really bad. And I think that there are 10,000 respirators, and they have to make a whole lot more to deal with the emergency. But if you can stagger this and recirculate it in different ways, then you may be able to deal with that emergency more effectively. But also, many of the doctors who are working now are sick. They have it, and they have to work anyway.
Right.
And so the whole idea of quarantine is great at the very beginning, but now it's way beyond that. A quarantine is useless right now. And I think the UK is acknowledging this. It's already out in the general public. And we just have to test.
The
as much
UK,
as
I have
we
to
can.
say one thing about the UK. The UK is probably the most neoliberal society next to the United States on the face of the earth. And if you ask me, their whole plan is let as many people die as possible, because those who live will be stronger because of it. And others who are, let's say, more social oriented. If you take the continent, the Norwegian, Scandinavian countries and whatnot, their idea is let's not unnecessarily jeopardize the risk populations, and knowing full well that it's still going to come. So it is a way of doing it, but a lot of it has to do with what your fundamental belief is in the value of the human being.
Well,
and in the UK, the value of the human being is next to zero.
I just want to add something, and I know we're running out of time, but just briefly about if you can find something that inspires you or makes you feel better about yourself or about the human race, go for that. Pay good attention to that. And there's plenty of evidence that there are people who are making gigantic breakthroughs on this planet. And they may be underreported, but we have access to communicate with different people.
I agree.
And I wanted to show you something about, I took a cold bath. I did about 20 minutes of breath work. So everything was oxygenated, and I sat in an ice cold tub of water for 5 minutes. And I got it, and it wasn't pleasant. It was a very intense experience, actually, but because I would breathe, my body has gotten adapted to, okay, normally we would have this guy scream and jump out of the tub, but because he's relaxing and breathing, then the body stops panicking. The habitual response to panic with the cold is you can override that. And when I get up out of the tub, drop, get dressed, I feel great. I feel zinging with energy, more energy than I know what to do with. I could easily go run a marathon. But I'm just saying this because we can influence our states.
Right.
And our body minds are extremely flexible and can endure enormous and are enormously resilient, or none of us would be here. But I think this is just a different way of thinking about the immune system. That doesn't mean I can't get sick, but it does mean that I think how well you've taken care of yourself, if you've given yourself good stress rather than just bad stress by eating junk food, like taking a cold bath as an example, or doing breathing exercises, you may still get sick, but it'll be a different kind of relationship to the illness. And the virus will have a different relationship to you than if all you've done is sat and watched TV and ate potato chips for 10 years. So I think we have an influence, a big influence on the outcome of these outbreaks. And we can create conditions for a different kind of health that won't necessarily be sponsored by our medical establishment. They don't want that. if they can't patent it and turn it into a drug and give it back to you, they're not interested. So I say let's create alternative narratives and go out, find the herbs, find the meditation, find the breath work, do something that may seem extreme, but actually your body can get used to it.
John, you just make a good case of what I try to, when I talk to people and when I'm out in public. And I think the reason they don't do it, if you listen to their language, they're caught in the deficient rational
Right.
way of relating, deficient rational way of relating to the bodies, because of the major metaphor that you hear from people is their bodies are a machine.
That's right.
And so this goes to the point that the better that we bring on the mental efficient to counteract the rational efficient in terms of our own body-mind systems.
So I'll do that right now. Our body, it can be a battlefield, and that may be a useful metaphor. Your body can, I prefer to use the body is music. The body, the immune system is musical. It makes meaning through these complex relationships, which no one is able to model. The immune system is so much smarter than we will ever be. So I'm just saying, think about music.
Yeah.
Think about harmonies and what's dissonant
Or
and exciting.
Or
And
I like to say, I tell people, your body's more like a plant and an animal. So look at the breeze through the trees. I love watching animals. Because music, I'm tying music for me personally is movement. So that's where I'm on board with what you're talking about.
so we got two metaphors. We got music, we got plants. And
Yeah.
I bet if I went around the circle, I'm not going to do this today, but this may be another project. When you are healthy, at your best, that's like what? I bet we could probably come up with
It's
5
like
different
this, John.
metaphors.
Like this.
I can do
Naked, naked.
You can do that one. I'll watch. Okay.
I'll pass.
So let's keep those metaphors going. I think that's really important. And new
Thank you.
alternatives, new
You can see
stories.
I have to come up with a garment for the team, you know.
Thank you. Right on.
Even if it's just a T-shirt, that would be so cool. Have a logo on it. So next
Thank
time,
you,
guys.
Boxer shorts with logo.
Stay
Thank you,
healthy,
guys.
everyone.
Yeah.
Stay
you
healthy.
Too. You too.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care of yourselves.
Bye, everybody.
Until next time.
See
Next
you next
time.
time.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.